Chapter 9 The Wog Dog Conquers Greece. Every 4 miles along the road we would pass a whitewashed box set upon a post. Through the glass front a little lamp would be steadily burning at the foot of a miniature crucifix fronting a painting of the traveller's patron saint, St. Francis, I believe. A till in each box contained a few coins. The shrine offered any traveler the opportunity of worship, and, if needed, the money to buy food along the road. Peaceful symbols, these, in a lovely country, soon to be trampled under the iron-shod heel of the invader. As we passed through Larissa, Horrie barked frantically at the sky and, leaping up, overbalanced to tumble into the outspread arms of folk below. What bit him then, I wonder, said Fitz, as we glanced up to see a stork perched on its huge nest high up on a church steeple, the solemn stork gazing so calmly down on the laughing people. The excited little dog made a scene that lingers sweetly in my memory. That night we camped off the road by the side of a rocky hill, green under bramble, gay with red poppies and white flowers. Through a valley a stream flowed over a bed of snowy pebbles. Along the banks on either side, little fields of green and golden barley rippled under a whispering breeze. "It is a beautiful country," said Don that evening. The rebels were unusually silent, gazing up at the golden stars, dreamily aware of the tinkle of tiny bells on the necks of sheep and goats wandering upon the hills. "Yes, it's a lovely country," sighed Popa, and we felt sadness in his voice. "It's not the first time that armies have marched through here," protested Gordy, "and the country and people still survive." "They'll survive this one too," declared Feathers. We were silent, only just beginning to realize what our small force was to face. Next day Don and I were ordered to travel by cycle, so Horrie was parked inside my great coat, which I belted so that he could not fall through. He insisted upon seeing all that was to be seen, and poked his little head out between 2 buttons. To the delight of the Greek folk, whose attention he attracted by his ever-ready bark, he was to travel very many miles in this fashion, some of them awful miles, the terrible miles of a retreating army, plowing back through hail and mud under a pitiless rain of bombs and shells. I had only to sit on the cycle and unbutton the coat, and Horrie would scramble up and dive in like a baby kangaroo into the pouch. In a moment his little head would be poking out, and he was ready for the road. The instant I stopped, however, he would stumble out. That first morning we traveled on and up through the Thermopylae Pass of deathless memory. The road wound round and round as we climbed. At the top we gazed down upon a beautiful scene. 9 sections of the road were clearly visible, each at different height as it climbed the hills. Far below, the green fields were spread out like a chessboard, with little white dolls' houses of farms. A long, perfect stretch of road gleamed like silver in the light as it cleanly divided the chessboard from the bottom of the pass. Towering distantly above this scene gleamed the snowy crown of Mount Olympus. The day grew very cold. I felt the wog dog draw deep down in the coat until only the tip of his nose was visible. Then that, too, disappeared. "I feel Horrie shivering," I said. "I'm a bit that way myself," replied Don, "but we must fix Horrie up. I've an idea." "What is it?" "I've got a couple of spare socks. We'll cut the heels and toes off and draw the remainder over his body. He'll be snug as a bug in a rug." I laughed. "Let's do it." So we dismounted and very soon fitted Horrie with his nightie. It was a tight fit. He looked comically uncomfortable, but as he felt the warmth his tail began to wag, and he gazed up with appreciative brown eyes, plainly saying, "Thanks, boys. You two certainly do know just what a fella needs." We were surprised that no aircraft had yet had a shot at us, but were to discover that torrential rains had hopelessly bogged the enemy air force. That rain saved us many lives. Time found us establishing battalion headquarters at the foot of Mount Olympus, towering nearly 10,000 feet above, capped with snow that gleamed through the purple haze. Around us rose the majestic mountains of Greece. Through rock-walled passes ahead came the echoing thunder of guns. Around us thousands of men were busy with a grim earnestness. Along the rocky road a stream of trucks was arriving, loaded with materials for the gluttonous maw of war. "We are going to be busy soon," observed Fitz. "You're busy now," called Popa. "Come and give a hand with this gear." "The old warhorse smells action," nodded Gordy. "We all will soon," said Murchy eagerly, "judging by that nasty noise coming over the mountains." "We'll be in a dangerous position here," remarked an artilleryman, "if the Greeks collapse away out on the left flank." "Poor beggars," said a weary, mud-covered soldier. "They've fought like Trojans throughout months of it, and now must stand up against the German panzers and Stukas." Sergeant Popa, working like a Trojan and supervising signal communication, came hurrying across with orders. Fitz and Gordy to remain temporarily at BHQ for signal duties, he ordered. Feathers to go with A Company in charge of a section of attached signalers. Murchy to be spotter on the adjutant's car. Don and Moody for dispatch riding duty under Corporal Thurgood. "And what are you going to do?" inquired Murchy. "I am taking over the duties of signal officer and signal sergeant as well," snapped Popa. "Got anything against it?" "Oh no," drawled Murchy as he lit a cigarette. "Neither will the enemy. You won't be feeling quite so smart a few hours from now, my bright lad," promised Popa grimly, and hurried away to his duties, followed by our grins. A great old scout, Sergeant Popa. Presently D Company moved out towards the fighting at the Albanian border, while A, B, and C companies moved out to join two Australian and a New Zealand brigade, now in heavy action defending Servia Pass, some 16 miles further ahead. We stood silently and watched our mates hurrying towards the hoarse rumbling of the guns. Next morning early I received orders to rush a message to the firing line. I felt a funny little tremor away down in the pit of my stomach. The mud-caked, grim-faced wounded spoke without words of what was happening away up in the iron-jawed heads of the pass. The rebels were all away at various jobs. Any of the lads would gladly have kept an eye on Horrie, but I determined to take him with me. I couldn't have faced the rebels had anything happened to him while he was in my charge. "We're in for it now, Horrie," I said, and patted the little wog dog. We mounted and started up the long historic road. Horrie, peeping from my greatcoat, was this day to see more sights, hear more things than ever his insatiable interest and curiosity could stomach. The road proved muddy as we rode on to the rumble of the guns. Burned-out trucks and smashed flotsam of war littered the roadside. Progress became slower and slower. I was riding cautiously, staring at the mouth of the pass looming in front, wondering why the stretch of road just ahead was ominously deserted. The noise of the cycle's engine muffled sound until a screaming roar lifted the hair on my scalp. The mud spat up to machine gun bullets as I hauled the cycle over. We crashed into the ditch as the diving plane roared past. He zoomed up, but another was roaring down as my finger felt for the little wog dog's head. "Are you all right, Horrie?" I whispered. Breathlessly, I squeezed into the mud as the second plane screeched down with machine gun bullets hissing around us. Horrie kicked frantically under me as the third plane roared down, and for a second I thought he was hit. But it was the spill into the ditch and the scream of the planes that had terrified him. They had scared me, let alone the little dog. The three planes, as they zoomed up, circled lazily overhead. I peered up anxiously and saw the devils' heads gazing down from the machines. I could visualize the grins on the cynical masked faces. The machines began to climb in a horribly suggestive circle. I scrambled up and seized the bike to race for cover before they could dive again. Horrie whimpered in sympathetic understanding that something tragic was doing. My heart thumped violently at a screech of brakes. Then a voice called down from a big truck. "Are you all right, Dig?" "Yes, no, yes, no," I grinned. "You nearly frightened the life out of me. I'm a bit winded, that's all. Those planes spilled me into the ditch." "It's lucky the ditch was handy," he said. "Sure, you're all right." "I think so," I replied hopefully. "Then race for the pass," he advised. "They'll be back in a minute," and the big truck lumbered off. I leaped on the bike and was away with an eye on the three planes climbing and turning away to the left as the pilots gazed down in search of victims. There was a half-mile of straight road between me and the pass. I leaned over the handlebars and went flat out, heartened by the roar of truck engines as a convoy appeared behind me. Spotters clung to the running boards, searching the skies. "Still, Horrie, keep still," I implored. "Good dog, good dog." Horrie was very nervous, and should he leap out, I didn't know what might happen. The road was awful pitted with bomb holes, greasy with mud. We couldn't make it, but this time I heard them, and slewing the bike off the road, jumped off and tumbled into a ditch, hugging Horrie. "Thank heaven," I muttered. "We beat them that time." The trucks had pulled up with a screech of brakes, while all hands jumped down and raced to cover. In an instant the road was devoid of life. There was just a long line of stationary trucks. Above them were the diving planes, with sirens screaming, machine guns rat-tat-tatting, answered now by the vicious crackle of rifle fire from the men lying in the fields. And so it went on. The enemy planes were enjoying the game. They'd zoom up and circle as if to fly away. Then, when the trucks got going again, they'd suddenly wheel and dive straight down. With each run off and dive into the ditch, Horrie began to regain confidence. His ears pricked up, and I could feel his stub of a tail wagging as we dived off the road, and he leapt out to cover with excited barks. Apparently the planes were short of bombs, though once they dropped to some distance away. Horrie and I, racing, and fell into a furrow and stayed there feeling big as pyramids while waiting for the worst. The play went out of Horrie to the shattering roar of the explosions. Pressed into the furrow, his eyes glared up at the planes, and his hair rose on end. He growled as ferociously as a very small dog can possibly growl. Those bombs obviously took his memory back to the raid on Idriess. He knew now this was no game. When silence reigned, I peeped up and laughed to see heads popping up all over the plowed field, all eyes watching the receding planes, and almost everyone saying the same thing. "Missed you bees, missed." I held up Horrie to gaze after the vanishing planes. His eyes fairly spat fire, and he growled menacingly, to the relieved laughter from the boys. From that moment, Horrie became the troop's best spotter. Wherever he might be, he was immediately to become famous at detecting approaching enemy planes. In all our various movements, throughout all the fighting that we saw after this, Horrie would always be the first to pick up sounds of approaching aeroplanes, and some among us would always keep an eye upon Horrie. "Planes," a man would shout, and we'd dive for cover, for Horrie would have been noticed sitting very erect with his ears cocked, a look of intense interest on his face. Immediately that he growled, then the cry would arise, "Planes!" But this was Horrie's first morning in battle, apart from the raids on Idriess. At least the 3 planes did fly away, and as we were breathing sighs of relief, their place was suddenly taken by 21 devils that dived down with the scream of bombs howling above the screech of sirens. I called to Horrie as he led the way, and we dived into a hole as a bomb exploded with a shattering roar. The wog dog pressed himself against me, his little heart thumping. "Good dog," I said encouragingly. "Keep low, it will soon be over." Bomb after bomb shattered the crackle of rifle fire as the machines roared low over the convoy, spraying it with lead. As they sped away for more bombs, men leapt from the earth and ran for trucks, and within seconds the convoy was heading for the mouth of the pass, now very close. But the frightful noise and grim fear of death had again put the wind up the wog dog. As for me, we gained the mouth of the pass. The gloomy iron walls of the mountains now sheltered us in some degree from the plains. The road now was a nightmare, pockmarked with shell and bomb craters, the mud from which was a quagmire. The sight of the once pretty little village of Servia, clinging on the western side of Mount Olympus, would turn any man against war. It was a rubble of smoking ruins. Families of warm-hearted people had lived and loved and toiled in that village only a matter of days before. As I passed the ruined village, I was halted by one of the road patrol. "Be careful, Dig," he advised. "Jerry is shelling the pass again. Been through before." "No." "Well, here's the drum. Good oil. Work your way quickly, close up beside that second bend. See a way ahead." "Yes." "Well, when you get there, keep close to cover and watch the head of the pass. Stay there until you see the flashes." Of the gun, then beat it through the bend before they fire the second shell. Don't worry about the first shell. It'll be at you soon as you see the flash. If it misses, then go for your life." "Thanks," I said. "Where did you get the pup?" He grinned. "At the first flash," I replied from a single-track mind. "Not scared, are you?" he asked a little anxiously. "No," I lied. "Oh, the pup. We brought him from the desert outside Alexandria." "You don't say. How on earth did you manage to get him here?" "Oh, we got help all along the line. Lots of the boys helped us out of little difficulties." "I suppose they would," he said. "He's a bonzer little pup. He'll make a good little soldier, too." "He'll be okay," I replied. "Thanks, Dig," and I rode on, leaving him to his dangerous post. He seemed to be an accusing sort of chap, but I'll admit I did have the wind up a bit. "Will just a little bit." I reached the second bend safely and pulled up alongside a stationary truck. The driver was standing by the side of the truck, dreamily gazing up towards the head of the pass. "How's she going?" I asked. "Not bad, Dig," he replied absent-mindedly. "The first one's coming." He nodded as we both dived into a ditch, hurried by a heavy explosion over the embankment. "This one should be in the diddle middle of the ditch," he said as he wiped mud out of his eye. Thank heavens his judgment was a few yards out. The shell landed with a crash just over the embankment, a few yards to our left. Chapter 10. The Wog Dog Saves Lives. "We're Jake. All right now for a bit." He drawled and lazily stood up. "Although you can't bank on it, Jerry is using a pretty big mortar and occasionally whips in a quick fourth for good measure. That's the one that might catch a man. Yes, he grinned. Jerry knows all the tricks. I crawled out from the ditch, holding my hands reassuringly over the great coat. "Hullo," exclaimed my muddy friend. "You look like you're in the family way." "It's my little dog," I grinned, and took Horrie out from the coat. His tongue tried hard to lick me. His tail still had a waggle. He had a wag too for the driver, who grinned and patted him. "Look, Dig," he suggested. "The road is knocked about pretty badly around the next bend. You'll be kept very busy managing that machine and dodging Jerry's shell fire. You'll get it hot and strong soon as we poke our nose round the bend. Better let me take the pup in the truck and I'll pick you up at the end of the pass." Thankfully, I accepted the offer, and Horrie, to his dismay, vanished into the truck, which started immediately. As I pushed the bike to the road, I saw Horrie's little face anxiously pressed to the window to see if I was coming. I leapt on and waved to him. Then all my time was taken up watching the greasy, broken road, leaning a little more closely over the handlebars. Again there came that whiz, with a crash to the side or behind me. There was no time to dodge the shells. It was just a race to get through the pass. I'll never forget the feeling of relief when we managed it and got shelter from that merciless confined shelling. From close by in the mountains came the sustained roar of rifle and machine-gun fire, but it did not have the terrors of the whining howl of shell splinters deep down in Hellfire Pass. Horrie did not wait to be let out of the truck. He jumped from the window. "That little bloke was very worried about you," laughed the driver. "Yes," I said, as Horrie nearly tried to eat me. "Well, good luck, Dig," smiled the driver as he bent to his controls. "Thanks a lot." "She's right," he nodded as the truck moved away. Out among the hills I located B Company, reported to the SIGs, and carried on with my job. "You got the pup through," grinned Nippy Burke. "Yes, by a stroke of luck. But I wish I could have left him with the rebels. I'm afraid I mightn't get him back again. Goodness knows what jobs I'll be detailed to out here. I'll take him back to the boys, if you like, when I return," volunteered Ron Baker. Ron was our signal truck driver, and I accepted his offer gladly. The little wog dog had endeared himself to all of us. I hated to think of him as mangled in the mud among these grim black mountains. Back at BHQ actually was no safer, but there at least he would be among the boys. At least some or other of the boys would always be on hand. "You've been experiencing a torrid time," I said. "Yes," grinned Bill Arrowsmith. "We've had our moments," and he ruefully felt a busted nose. "What gave you that lump on the head?" I asked Nippy. "You look as if you'd been hit by a shell." "It felt worse than that," grinned Nippy. "The planes came very suddenly and strafed us. I jumped for that big olive tree and dived around it fair onto Bill's head as he scooted round the other side. "It was the funniest thing out," laughed Ron. "I saw the crash from another tree, and was laughing fit to bust when I felt a little tug at my tail. I stopped laughing when I saw what it was," and he showed me a bullet hole drilled low down through the tail of his coat. "A near miss, that," grinned Bill. "It was," said Ron thoughtfully. "I hate to think what would have happened if I'd been bending. We carried on with our various jobs, while ahead of us slowly grew stronger and stronger the grim pressure of war. Far above, through purple haze, there now and then gleamed the snow cap of Mount Olympus, overlooking this passing battle, as it had overlooked so many battles that throughout history had surged down the pass of Servia. What terrible tragedies have taken place there! How many times has a forlorn little army battled to hold that pass against overwhelming odds, just as our army was bleeding to hold it today. How thankful we felt that our nation, though small in number, lives in a great continent with mighty seas around it. But the unfortunate Greeks dwell in a tiny area of land, pressed in by hungry nations of great power. We, in our happy country, have not the faintest idea of what unhappy little nations, like the Greeks, have suffered throughout the centuries. Ron Baker set out on the return trip with Horrie, the little wog dog, very anxious as he gazed back imploringly at me. This hurry-scurry of war, these breathtaking movements, these waves of terrifying sound, with the grim atmosphere of tragedy and the tension, were very different to the martial tramp of the carefree parades. The little wog dog sensed this was a phase of soldiering he must try very hard to understand. To my great relief, I was soon afterwards ordered to carry a message back to BHQ. Soon the bike and I were racing down the pass again. It seemed easier now. I had been through it once, but I raced on trying to overtake the truck. When through the pass, I saw the truck in the distance, tearing across the straight stretch beyond. Suddenly it pulled up, and Ron scrambled out of the truck with the wog dog under his arm. They dived to shelter as the planes roared down. I dived too. 3 times again those wretched planes forced us to dive for cover. Finally I overtook the truck just as it entered the bushy track leading to BHQ. Ron was just in time to grab Horrie as he leapt at the cabin window when he saw me. "He's nearly twisted his neck trying to gaze back along the road," laughed Ron. With Horrie trotting ahead, tail mast high, we visited the cook's quarters and forgot the terrors of the pass in ravenous enjoyment of a meal. That night Murchie strolled in with his cheery old grin and swapped experiences of the pass. "So you've been through it too," he said to Horrie. "You're a full-blown soldier now." Popa came in soon after and was joyfully greeted by Horrie. "It's all right, Horrie," said Popa. "We're all going to answer roll call this time. The rest of the boys will blow in soon, except Fitz and Gordy," he explained to us. "They've gone out for the time being to replace Harry Doran and Matt Taylor. The poor lads have been hit. Rotten luck," said Murchie quietly. "Good blokes, too. Don and I rigged a little shelter from the bitter night with our gas capes and waterproof ground sheets. There was just sufficient room to crawl in under the cover. You can bet Horrie crawled in too and cuddled up at our feet. That night we quietly decided that things obviously were very serious. There was no telling what would happen. If there was any confusion and the rebels were split up, with none of us able to look after Horrie, we would give him to Doc Sholto Douglas to look after. We knew he would keep an eye on Horrie, although he was now very busy. But he was one of Horrie's many friends, and the medical unit would always be kept intact, or as intact as the fortunes of war would allow. We would thus know where to find Horrie again, should the worst happen. We did not care even to voice our thoughts that it was possible the very worst might happen. Morning found our shelter crisp with icicles, cold diamonds in the brilliantly bitter morning. "I hate to think of wounded men lying out in this," murmured Dawn. "They'd be asleep long ago," I replied. We crept out of shelter while the tip of Horrie's nose peeped out of the blankets to watch us. But he didn't move, not he. He stayed there snug and hidden under the warm blankets for another 2 hours. Popa was away, bright and early on his cycle. Dawn watched him disappearing down the track leading to the pass. "He'll be all right," said Murchie. "Couldn't kill him with a ton of bricks. The old warhorse will see us all out." Dawn laughed. The rebels would take it hard should anything happen to Sergeant Popa. A few hours later we saw him returning with a passenger, but he helped him to the RAP tent. "Who did you bring in?" I inquired as he wheeled his bike back towards us. "Yugoslav," he replied, somewhat defiantly I thought. "Picked him up this side of the pass, leg pretty badly mangled." Later we found out that Popa's Yugoslav wore an iron cross on the left breast of his tunic, but Popa only grinned. Doc Douglas treated the German and he was sent to the rear in an ambulance. Being detailed for a job, I walked to the bushes where my cycle was concealed. Horrie struggled in Dawn's arms. "He's ready for another job," laughed Dawn. "He's been through his baptism of fire and wants another go." "He'll get more than he wants here," I replied as I mounted. "Don't let him follow me. I don't want to take him through the pass again. It's getting stickier every hour." The wog dog blossomed into a war dog, as if by magic, despite the fact that we long since had ceased to wonder at his instinct and intelligence and adaptability. He knew the whistle of bullets, the whine of shells, the scream of a bomb. He knew exactly what to do. In a moment he could act at some sudden alarm. He knew at any time what was doing and was intelligently ready to take his place at the right time and in the right way. The wog dog grew very dear to all of us, but he saved us trouble and casualties many a time, instinctively, although each going quietly about our jobs on what appeared a most peaceful morning. Always a man or two would have his eye on the wog dog. Immediately that questioning little head went up. Immediately he sat back and gazed steadfastly into the skies. Some man or other would stand and stare at Horrie. Should the dog bark then instantly the shout, "Planes!" arose, and Horrie would be leading the stampede for the nearest slit trench to jump in, and bark, a warning for us to follow quickly. After the raid was over, Horrie would receive graciously accept numerous pats for his timely warning. Very soon we all learned not to laugh at him, for despite everyone's danger, the impulse to laugh was almost irresistible. He was such a comical little fellow. His dignity and his every movement were comical, especially when racing to lead us all to safety. We'd long since known the little dog was deeply sensitive, but never dreamed how sensitive until we were crossing the log. This was over an icy mountain stream. A tree that had fallen across was our only method of crossing, but that tree was very slippery. The wog dog, of course, took the lead to show us how to cross. He trotted to the log with tail mast high, dignity on his little funny face. When halfway across the log, he slipped and splashed down into the stream amid roars of laughter. Swimming to the opposite bank, he scrambled out, shook himself, then, in very dignified fashion, stepped on to the log and advanced towards us. When halfway across he stopped, gazed at us, and barked. When satisfied that all were watching him, he deliberately jumped into the stream and swam ashore. He made his act perfectly plain. He had not fallen in at all. He did it on purpose to make us laugh. After that, we never laughed at him, unless he was obviously playing. We thereafter respected Horrie's dignity, which was very precious to him. The tide of war rolled on. The enemy had brought up great weight of reinforcements, and metal, determined to overwhelm us, roll down the pass and flood out upon Greece. Our reinforcements were pitifully small, while as to our metal and air cover, the Anzac Corps felt it was to be a fight to the death when rumors came fast that our Greek allies, bravely struggling away on our left flank, were in bad shape. Their line had been breached in a number of places. If we did not get reinforcements and guns and munitions to them quickly, there was danger of them collapsing. There were no reinforcements, no guns, no munitions. The thunder of gunfire at the head of the pass had grown into an increasingly threatening roar. At times the sky seemed full of enemy planes shrieking down upon us. Wounded, utterly weary, exhausted Greek soldiers, in ones and twos, then threes and fours, began to stagger in towards us from the Albanian flank, the beginning of the end. Chapter 11. The Hell of War. When the withdrawal commenced, it fell to the rebels, among others, to keep the trucks moving. Swarms of trucks came down from the mountains and the Albanian front to converge in the pass, trucks loaded with wounded men, with ammunition and gear and stores, with all the flotsam of an army in stubborn fighting retreat. We rode up and down the long convoy, sorting out tangles and bottlenecks, guiding the harassed drivers, directing them at turnoffs. Ray Thurgood worked like a tiger, setting us an example we will never forget. Other men were toiling similarly, far up and down the struggling convoy, behind which the rear guard were fighting hour by desperate hour. Every disputed yard against the horde pressing us back was to mean the lives of men, our men. Alas, sunset was falling over Greece, and its shadows were black as the shadows of the mountains that blackened the fateful pass. Greek soldiers were now drifting back fast from Albania. Whole groups of them, blood-stained, muddy, ragged men, haggard of face, exhausted in body, the glare of despair in their eyes. Rags were bound about their feet against the pitiless rocks and thorns and mud. Their boots were long since worn out. Like ghosts, they came staggering down the hillsides, emerged from the gullies, swayed there to stare at us until we beckoned them to come for help and something to eat. Their gratitude at tins of bully beef and army biscuits was pitiable. Many carried single-shot rifles, obsolete before the last war. What other little equipment they had was long since out of date, yet these were the fragments of remnants of the men who for so long had held the Albanian border against Italy. And now along the road from the pass came shuffling in tragically growing numbers that most pitiably flotsam of war, women and children, sick and old men, little children bravely clinging to their mothers' skirts, babies clutched tight under shawls, bowed bodies wearily plowing through mud, marching with the growing trucks, back through mud and sleet and rain. Night crept down, smothering that long trail of misery, but through the gloom behind again and again burst the dull red flashes of war. Those who sank by the roadside, alas, they stayed there. We gave them all the bully and biscuits and blankets and help that we could, but their numbers swelled until at last we had nothing but silent sympathy to give. The little wog dog battled on with us throughout all the retreat, very quiet now. Well, he sensed that this road was tramped by the tragedy of despair, and yet when we could no longer help these people, they still had a friendly wave for us, a sad smile. But when they thought we could not notice, their faces were grim and set. Pulling up for a much-needed rest one morning, I noticed an old woman pantingly trying to dig a hole beside her cottage wall. She was one of the two old ones, too weak to join the throng, battling back before the roar of war, now so close behind. She must stay. With a pity near to tears, I dragged myself up to see what she was doing, and to ask if I might help. The wog dog ambled silently up to her, and gazed up at the poor old soul. She was laboring to dig a hole in the frozen earth, in which to hide a few tins of bully beef the troops had thrown her food. It meant possible life to her for just a little while longer, food that she felt she must hide from a mighty army. Devouree, she smiled and pointed towards the fateful north. Hastily I dug the hole, dropped the tins in, covered them, and made as sure as I possibly could that no one could suspect a hole had been dug there. That morning was bitterly cold. but through lack of sleep and exhaustion, I was sweating before the job was finished. I glanced round, and there she was sitting on the edge of a little stone wall, nursing Horrie and murmuring down at him, smiling at him from a face of 1,000 wrinkles. The guns behind us were breaking into a roar of sound. Propping the spade against the wall, I crossed over to her, and taking Horrie, put him within my coat. His little head immediately popped out, and gazed at the old woman. With tears welling to her eyes, she smiled and put one hand to mine, and one to Horrie's head. She mumbled something. I gazed down, not daring to speak, but Horrie licked the old gnarled hand. "God protect you," I muttered, and hurried back to the convoy. Raid after raid hurtled down on the badly battered convoy, blasting truck after truck in geysers of mud and splintered metal. As the troops staggered back from cover, it was to work like maniacs, pushing the burning wrecks. From the road, there must be no hold-up because following convoys, and finally the desperately pressed rear guard, must fight a way back along this narrow road, around which there was no detour. The lives of all behind depended on those in front to keep moving. When in sight of Larissa, we were too numbed from our own bitter experiences to say much. Larissa was in ruins. God help the friendly people who had cheered us as we passed through only a short time ago. Now only a heap of stone was the church and high steeple where the stork had surveyed the peaceful scene below. I wonder what that stork thought when the bombs came screaming down to blast the church and his home and the little town to ruins. The Germans had given the folk of Larissa 3 hours to vacate the town, and the convoy had halted to allow the people to pour out and get a start on down the road ahead. It was humane, and the only thing to be done, though it was too mean hell for us. A company was hurriedly turned aside to defend the battered airfield, while the rest of us closed up where the head of the convoy had halted at Larissa. A train was there, already hopelessly overcrowded. Numerous people and children were still hurrying towards the station, while overhead 3 enemy planes hovered like birds of prey. When riding through the center of the town, I passed 30 little girls, all dressed in white, marching quietly towards the railway. 6 children walked in front, carrying a white sheet quartered by a broad red cross. 1 child held each corner and 1 each side. The pathetic little party marched bravely on with the roar of the planes low overhead. Several little smiles, several little hands fluttered at me as I passed by. Surely such little children, carrying the emblem of mercy, would have nothing to fear. The little party was in the charge of 5 nuns. Probably they were from a convent somewhere in Larissa. The convoy pushed on. Outside Larissa, the road south was a weary stretch of flat, swampy ground, a nightmare with rain and mud and the churning of countless vehicles. Over this Devil's Crossing there was not a blade of cover, so the convoy pushed stolidly on against the scream of planes, hiss of machine gun bullets, roar of exploding bombs. Hell was here, night and day. Any truck that slid a yard off the road was finished. Any truck hit by a bomb was finished. We plodded slowly on, trucks, soldiers, women, children, old men, wounded men, dogs. The roar of hell was above and bursting among us all the time. While checking the passing of my section trucks, I noticed one missing, and with a sinking of the heart I turned back towards Larissa to try and locate it. All this time the wog dog had stayed quiet as a mouse within my great coat. I could feel the warmth of him. He knew something awfully tragic was happening. I passed a shocking sight as I pushed the bike through the mud. I dare not stop a moment, lest I break down or go mad. The huddled, muddied bodies of children in white fragments of a white sheet, with torn cross all muddied and red, red, red. The little bodies lay there like crushed, broken little red and white roses. An Australian ambulance crew was bending over them, but one glance showed me that few indeed were left to remember their little playmates. I pushed on, hatred rending me, cursing those inhuman devils, those accursed Gorings, and their magnificent Luftwaffe. Blessed for me it was that soon afterwards Horrie gave me a great fright. To the roar of planes he leapt from the great coat with a warning bark and raced for cover. His little legs could carry him faster through the mud than mine. He paused to see that I was following. Then, at the whine of falling bombs, barked frantic warning, and leapt ahead plainly sang, "Every dog for himself." He vanished, and the bombs exploded in mud and flame and choking smoke. As the planes roared away, I struggled up from the mud and whistled for Horrie. Strange, he did not return. Feeling horribly sick, I staggered in the direction I had seen him last, whistling piercingly. His smothered bark made my heart thump again. I found him in a narrow trench, far safer cover than we had, but what an awful sight was Horrie! He had jumped into a latrine, and phew! The boys laughed hysterically as we struggled back to the trucks. It was not until late that night that I could get petrol to wash the little wretch. The Greek forces on our left had now been overwhelmed, and the enemy was pouring into the rear of the Thermopylae position from Yanina. The convoys plowed on and on. The rear guard fought their way back yard by yard, their blood staining the mud a slow purple. Was it not off the shores of Greece that the Romans fished for their royal purple, purple of the Caesars? It was while we worked like maniacs at a bogged truck that dawn came along. I laughed a silly laugh. How very, very glad I was to see dawn. The truck's front wheel had stopped, choked with mud, wedged tightly between the mud guard and the wheel. Smoke was issuing from the tires. Because of friction between tightly packed mud and rubber. We wrenched the mudguard upwards, the truck moved, and slowly the convoy pressed on. "Phew," said Don as we parked for breath. "It's not daisies I smell, it's Horrie," I gasped. Don looked questioningly as he held his nose. "If you ask any more questions, I'll burst into hysterics," I yelled. Don grinned, crawled up onto his bike, and rode away on his job. At last our section crossed that devil's mud and plowed on over the better road towards Lamia. Thank God the wintry sun sank at last. We pulled off the road while the drivers just stumbled off the trucks and sprawled down to camp for the night, dead beat, utterly done in. I found Ron Baker's truck where I'd arranged to meet Don and the boys. Horrie leapt out of the great coat with a yap of delight to meet his numerous friends and ravenously eat the scraps of bully and biscuit showered upon him. He trotted to truck after truck on visiting bent and stretching his little legs. I was very worried at seeing no sign of Don. I had been riding at the head of the company, he in the rear. Popa loomed up out of the darkness. I knew he was weary, but his alert eyes and grim-set mouth showed he was set for any emergency. "Where's Don?" he asked. "Missing. We'll find him." "Who is the last man to have seen him, and where?" "Ron Baker at the turnoff." "Come on, and be smart about it." So Ron Baker and Reg Jinks and I slouched back along the dark road amongst the strangely quiet trucks to the turnoff. We scouted round and on hands and knees in the darkness traced where 2 trucks had missed the turnoff. "It's all right," sighed Sergeant Popa. "Don's gone after them. He'll bring them back before they can run into the enemy lines. We'd better return to the unit in case we're needed." As we plowed slowly back, several little fires suddenly appeared on the hills around. "Spies or 5th columnists," growled Popa, lighting fires to show the Luftwaffe where we are. He seized a handy anti-tank gun and blazed towards the fires. The stutter of a machine gun suddenly awakened the night as it sprayed bullets toward the telltale fires. The fires were quickly extinguished. "They didn't think we'd wake up," growled Popa. "I'd love to have enough men to surround that hill." "It's only a very little hill, hardly a pimple," said Reg. "But I doubt if there's a man in the unit capable of climbing it. I can hardly stand myself." Dead to the world, it was 2 o'clock in the morning when I was forced back from deepest sleep. The dim form of Popa was bending over me. "Your turn, the piquet duty, lad," murmured Popa. I dragged myself up and staggered into the darkness. I crawled some 50 yards up the hill from the trucks and fought against sleep, with my tortured mind going back to the little children of Larissa, flitting from there to Don's absence, then back to the little children again. Horrie sat between my legs. I felt the warmth of his little tongue in sympathy upon my numbed hand. All pressed down we were by the pall of night, deathly silence over all the exhausted convoy. Away back the thunder of guns, crackling bursts of rifle fire, but around our sleeping camp was utter silence. A low growl from Horrie startled me back to duty. "What is it, Horrie?" I whispered. His body stiffened, his hair stiffened. He took a few paces up the hill, stopped, and growled again. The men who lit the fires flashed through my mind, and I clenched my rifle while sinking to the ground and trying to silhouette the hilltop against the sky. I crept up to Horrie, laid my hand upon him, and felt him quiver in warning. He could see what I could not see. "What is it, Horrie?" I whispered. he growled menacingly. Strain as I may, I could only distinguish the dim outline of rocks. Horrie began to advance with a threat in every movement of his tiny body. It was no longer comical to me. Bent low to the ground, I followed on noiseless feet. I dare not call to the sleeping men below, lest it prove a false alarm, but I knew this was no false alarm. Horrie insistently advanced, and presently I saw he was growling towards a crouching rock, now barely 30 feet away. With the sickening feeling of a bullet in the pit of the stomach, I whispered, "Stay put, Horrie," and touched him, and then crawled away to outflank that crouching rock, my eye upon it, the rifle poised to fire. I had only gone a little way when Horrie growled and rushed in at the dim form on the ground. I leapt in and called halt as a shadow rose to Horrie's attack. Kalanite, came the cry from a figure now standing motionless. Growling fiercely, Horrie ran back to me to face back at the stranger with a growl. "Advance 1 pace," I ordered, "but no more, or I shoot." Again he replied, "Kalanite." Kalanite was Greek for good night, but the shadow took 1 pace forward. I moved in close and motioned him down to the camp with the rifle. Horrie growling at his heels. I maneuvered the stranger to the OC's truck. Captain Plumer sent for the Greek's interpreter and interrogated the man. His story was that he was a shepherd seeking goats that had strayed from this flock upon the hill. Surprised at sight of the trucks at night, he could not have distinguished them from where he was, and startled by the dog he had laid down, fearful he might be mistaken for a fifth columnist. He stuck to the story, which was feasible enough. In the circumstances, nothing could be done. He was escorted from the camp to return to his flock. When daylight came, I searched the hill. There was no sign of the shepherd, nor was there the faintest sign that animals of any description had been anywhere upon that hill for a very long time. "You little trimmer," I said to Horrie, "you probably saved the camp. That fellow was in readiness to signal the Luftwaffe. We would have awakened to a tornado of bombs, those of us who did awake."